So we start, I think, by asking one question. How many people here, with the show of hands, have watched the Ken Burns documentary on the American Revolution? Okay, well, you can all go home now because you know it all. So thanks a lot for coming. Anyway, I should make it clear that I'm not really an expert on this subject in the sense that I'm not a historian who's studied this subject in immense detail, but I have picked up a lot of information along the way out of my own curiosity and work that I've been involved with. And as Asher mentioned, we did actually, in my high school, we studied American history and the Revolution. And of course, we learned that it wasn't so much that the Americans won, but that the British lost through repeated arrogance and folly. Anyway, this evening, I'm going to place some emphasis on some of the lesser known British supporters of the American cause. We'll look at some of the opponents as well, but I think probably the more interesting part is people in Britain who were on the American side or on liberty's side, if you like. So let's move on. Rule Britannia. This is one of the verses. This is verse 4 of Rule Britannia, which if you ever watched the last night of the proms at the Royal Albert Hall, this is always sung in a sort of semi-ironic way these days. But at that time, it was quite a serious patriotic song. And this particular verse speaks to some interesting strands that we're going to come into contact with this evening. Thee haughty tyrants ne'er shall tame, all their attempts to bend thee down will but arouse thy generous flame, but work their woe and thy renown, Rule Britannia, etc., etc. Now, the target of this verse is rather specific. It's not just general haughty tyrants, you know, French and Austrian, all these other people on the continent. It's specifically directed, actually, at the Stuart pretenders, the Stuart claimants to the British throne. At this time, when Anne wrote this, it was very shortly after the 1745 rebellion, in which Bonnie Prince Charlie, the son of the Stuart claimant to the throne, raised a pretty successful rebellion, which came somewhat close to overthrowing the Hanoverian throne. And this would have been seen by the writers of Rule Britannia and others as an unmitigated disaster, because the Stuarts had the reputation and the track record of being A, authoritarian, and B, Roman Catholic, which wasn't popular back then either. They had shown during the 17th century that they were perfectly willing to behave in an authoritarian and oppressive way towards their subjects. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had overthrown the Stuarts and replaced them with more amenable Dutch people, and then the Hanoverians. And the series of parliamentary acts and actions that had been taken at that time were felt to have established British liberties. The British Constitution, that's being celebrated in this song, was felt to be the best there was, and it gave tremendous amounts of liberty and freedom to people. It wasn't what we think of as a democracy in any way, but it was held to be, Britain was held to be a bastion of liberty. And that's important when we come to think about how the American colonists started to talk about liberty themselves. So Britons proudly thought of themselves as a free people enjoying liberty, which could be taken away, but they were determined that it would not be. Last year, this extraordinary artifact was found on the Princeton battlefield. And it speaks directly to the things I've just been talking about. The top view is the corroded state of the item as it was found, and then the bottom two are what the original, what good quality versions of this artifact actually look like. It commemorates the capture of the English city of Carlisle by the Hanoverian army led by the Duke of Cumberland, which had been captured by the Jacobite rebels a couple of months earlier. So what had happened was that the Jacobites had come down from Scotland, invaded England, and got as far south as Derby before they turned back. And so this medallion is commemorating the response to the Jacobite rebellion. And you see on the bottom row and on the right-hand side, it says, "Rebellion justly rewarded." And what you're seeing here, I'm going to use my pointy thing here. These are two Highlanders, Scottish Highlanders, being captured by a British soldier, and the Duke of Cumberland is saying, "Away with them." And over the top, it says, "Rebellion justly rewarded." But the funny thing about this artifact is that it was found on the American side of the battlefield. And this is a very interesting point. We know how the Battle of Princeton worked now very well. My colleague Wade Katz has been doing archaeological work there for a number of years, and we really have a very good idea now of who was what, who was where, when, and what. So we have to ask, why is a medallion commemorating the Hanoverian victory over the Jacobite rebellion being found on the American side? You might think that the Hanoverians, the George II as it was then, and George III during the time of the American Revolution, these are the tyrants, these are the evil people. So why would you keep a medallion of that event? Well, I think the answer is this: that whoever carried this object onto the Princeton battlefield felt that the Hanoverians, the current rulers, were regressing, and they were going back to the evil ways of the Stuarts. And so by fighting against the British army at Princeton, this American felt that they were fighting for the liberties, the traditional liberties of Britain that had been established after the Stuarts had been expelled. I hope it's a little complex, that, but I think it may be that you're seeing that the Americans are seeing themselves as the carriers of the banners of liberty that we see mentioned in Rule Britannia. So it's a most extraordinary artifact to have found. It could, of course, have been taken from a British prisoner, but it doesn't seem as if the battle really ran quite that way. And anyway, whoever owned this, if they'd obtained it at the time, they would be in their 40s or 50s at least at this time. So it may have been an heirloom, of course. But anyway, it's a most extraordinary item that introduces us to the complexity of all this. Let's start with the caricatures, shall we? We should do the beastly Brits. There's, of course, a one-dimensional portrayal of Britain and particularly the British Army in the Revolution as a crowd of disdainful, arrogant, tyrannical, casually brutal, snobbish aristocrats. And there's some truth to it. You can see those kind of people in the historical reality, but of course they are the caricature, and thank you Mel Gibson and Daniel Day-Lewis for reinforcing those, and particularly this one at the top, "Burn the Church." I've done a bit of research on British atrocities in the American Revolution, and atrocities generally, of which there were some, but there is no evidence that I've ever found of a British commander burning a church to the ground with people inside it. It was not a pleasant war, but it was not one that featured huge massacres and atrocities of that kind. But this is the easiest way to portray the enemy as far as Hollywood's concerned. These people are stupid, arrogant, incompetent as well, of course. But then you don't want them to be too incompetent, because you want to show that we can beat them even though they're competent, which they were. So again, it's complexity. The Declaration of Independence itself is rather sweeping in its dismissal of its supposedly deaf British brethren. This is one of the Jefferson's paragraphs in the Declaration. We've told them we wanted, please help us, and they've been deaf to the voice of justice. They haven't. The British people as a whole haven't helped us. It's not just mean old King George. The whole British people have been mean to us too, and they've been deaf. Well, as we see, they're not actually deaf, but the voices are hard to hear. The idea is that there's nobody in Britain with any empathy for the American cause. Of course, Jefferson knew perfectly well this wasn't the case, but we'll look at the British opponent first, and then we'll move on to some of the people who took a rather different kind of view. We're very lucky in that in the period of the American Revolution, there's a tremendous amount of pamphlets, cartoons, engravings of all kinds, expressing all kinds of different viewpoints. And actually, Asher has been kind enough to bring 3 of his mounted cartoons and prints from this period this evening. I'm sure he'll be happy to talk to you about them at the end. And these, of course, in themselves express the fact that freedom of speech and freedom of the press was actually still going on okay. And so it is a witness, it is a testament to that there were real liberties, even though the government in Britain was trying to quash dissent. It wasn't all that successful at doing so. Anyway, here's one sort of I sort of stand back sort of view. Here is on the left is a rather high fashion British Britannia saying, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." And the Indian princess on the right says, "Liberty, liberty forever, mother, while I exist." And it was sort of really expressing the sort of some of the viewpoints that were around there, rebellious colonials, and many people hearing the Americans saying liberty, 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 and which resonated. So there they are, slugging it out in 1776. Here's another cartoon which just sort of portrays England as rather a sort of broken down, one-legged guy trying to lead the American colonies by the nose with hooks through their nose. He's also got a cat o' nine tails, which he wants to presumably whip them with. But they are not responding well. One of them, I'm going to just, is shooting a pea shooter at him. And this guy is using a well-known gesture that's obviously had a long history. This is sort of people just making fun of the situation. England is sort of trying to do something and isn't really doing a very good job. So let's start by looking at one of the people who was not happy with the American Revolution. This is Nicholas Creswell. He's a farmer. You can see that in this portrait. In fact, his clothing is quite ordinary, and he's not wearing a wig. He's what you would think of as a yeoman farmer. He's the kind of farmer, in fact, that Jefferson wanted America to be made up of. Sturdy, independent yeoman farmers. So Nicholas Creswell, you have to feel sorry for him. This is his diary on March the 1st, 1774. So just at the beginning of stuff. I am on this day come to a determined resolution to go into America. A person with a small fortune may live much better and make greater improvements in America than he could possibly do in England. So he's coming over here to make his fame and fortune in the new world. And he has very high hopes for all this. The trouble is that by September of 1776, he's calling America this hateful country, and he sees nothing but tyranny and religious hypocrisy all around him. And he complains, if you don't tacitly admit to every insult or imposition they think proper, they immediately call you a Tory. So he's not in sympathy, and he says it's strange that the artifices of a few designing villains should have it in their power, but he means the revolutionary Americans, should have it in their power to ruin such a number of honest and well-meaning people. They have long been in possession of the greatest latitude of any people on earth, but unfortunately, they never knew the intrinsic value of it. And that was a sentiment that was heard a lot. The American colonists are already freer than anybody else on the planet, and now they're complaining about having to pay a few taxes. Well, come on. And anyway, he was totally disillusioned and went back to England once they let him out of prison. Other opponents at high and low levels. This is probably one of the best ones. Samuel Johnson, the writer of the first dictionary, English dictionary, wrote a response to the Declaration of Independence called Taxation, No Tyranny. It was very long and quite boring, which is why nobody ever reads it anymore. But he said that really it's in every empire, everybody has to pay taxes. Come on. But having sort of tried to be rational and reasonable, he comes out with statements like this: I'm willing to love all mankind except an American, a race of convicts who ought to be thankful for anything we give them short of hanging. Not an American supporter. And then, of course, these sentiments were pointed out pointedly about slavery. And Johnson says, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? And he's specifically talking about Jefferson, I think, there as the author of the Declaration. And as the Gentleman magazine, just a year later, slaves there are in America, and where there are slaves, their liberty is alienated. Now, of course, there's a certain amount of hypocrisy about this because, of course, Britain had enormous numbers of slaves, particularly in the West Indies on the sugar plantations. But there was no slavery in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom. It was illegal. It was not. There was no slavery in Britain itself, which again is a bit hypocritical, but it gave people like these somewhere to stand to say, you've got slaves, we don't. And yet you are the people calling for liberty. So. And even, well-known figures like John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, one of the major Protestant sects in America today, still, he was very much opposed to the revolution. He thought it was impious, really, and quite unjustified. And he published a 20-page pamphlet on it. He wrote 57 points criticizing the American position. And then, of course, we have British officers who say all the things that you might expect them to say. There were about 4,000 officers in North America during the Revolution in the British Army. Of those 4,000, we have about 170 memoirs. Most of the officers didn't write anything about their experience in America. But 170 of them did, and about half of those 170 express any kind of opinion about what's going on. The other half, they're just sort of saying, oh, we got up this morning and we went off and fought the rebels over there, and then we had to go down there and it was raining and cold. And they don't sort of comment on what it is they're doing. It's a war. They're fighting the rebels. That's all. They're not self-reflective. But a small number of them actually are. And some of them, most of them, as you might expect, are not very sympathetic either. This is Major Patrick Campbell over on the right there. He says, nothing but the bayonet and torch will ever bring this country's people to reason. And then William Evelyn up there, very handsome fellow, isn't he? Under no government on the face of the earth would they have been suffered to perpetrate so many horrid villainies as they have done without being declared in rebellion. Without being declared in a state of rebellion and having fire and sword let loose among them. So many of the officers thought that this was a rebellion. And if you're a rebel, you're a traitor and you deserve whatever you get. And one of the things that's, I think, a little surprising to me anyway about the American Revolution is how little of that there actually was. We all know about people like Nathan Hale who were hanged as spies, but I'm always brought back to the remembrance of the story of Richard Stockton in Princeton, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, captured by the British in late 1776. He could have expected to be hung as a traitor. In fact, strictly speaking, hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor. But he wasn't. He signed a loyalty oath to the crown and was released and lived quietly ever after. And it's somewhat surprising, isn't it, that someone who'd actually signed the Declaration of Independence was captured and was able to obtain his freedom. It's not again not a story that we hear about very much, because you'll see things saying not a single one of the signers of the Declaration did anything bad afterwards. Well, unfortunately, Richard Stockton did, but for reasons that we can all probably understand. That's moving on to a slightly maybe a more sympathetic character. I think I love the portrait of this guy. This is Colonel Stephen Campbell. He was born and died in New Brunswick, but he was the lieutenant colonel. He was the adjutant general of the British Army in North America during the Revolution. And so he had probably a fairly unique perspective on all this. And his observations are rather more personalized than most of the other officers' accounts. He talks about the country being unmercifully pillaged, which it clearly was. The British Army and its Hessian allies did not behave well when they came through an area. There was a great deal of pillaging and looting and, yes, raping and all that. And he says that it's no wonder the people refuse to join us if we behave like this. And he says that the Americans do it too, unfortunately. They have a scorched earth policy themselves. And so he says the scorched earth policy is not expected from people who profess principles of liberty and are friends to their country, but who by their proceedings are the cruelest of enemies. So he's saying it's not just one-sided, folks. The Continental Army doesn't do all that well sometimes either. Now, going back to cartoons, this is a cartoon, an anti-American cartoon, showing the Continental Army in its trenches besieging Boston in late 1775. And can't see it terribly well, but they've all got liberty caps on, saying liberty or death or liberty. And this guy's standing up on the top saying, it's plaguey cold. I don't think they'll shoot at us, do you? And they're all being presented as a fairly miserable crowd. And we'll look at this particular gentleman here, which is an interesting portrayal. So what he's saying is, "'Tis old Oliver's cause, no monarchy nor laws." Now, this man is a Presbyterian minister. Sorry. That's why he's dressed like that. And Presbyterians were very vocal supporters of the revolution. And what this cartoonist has this man saying is, hey, hey, folks, we're going back to the English Civil War of the 1640s. And how did that turn out? The monarchy was overthrown and replaced by a military dictatorship. And there was quite a lot of feeling like that in Britain too. If you do this, somebody will come along and take you over, and you'll be under a worse autocracy than you could possibly imagine under the British Crown. This was a sentiment that was expressed quite a lot, that it wouldn't go well. And of course, one of the brilliant and remarkable things about Washington was that he didn't do that. Oliver Cromwell did do that. He took over the government and became an autocratic ruler, despotic autocratic ruler. Washington didn't. And a lot of people were expecting him to. So Washington is remarkable in many ways. We're doing too much anti-American. I'm going to skip over these, but the next one is a call to solidarity with America. This is called the Sailor's Address, and it was published in a publication called the London Packet in July 1775. So it's after Lexington and Concord, but before the big stuff really gets going. And it's supposed to have been sung about London, as it says, to great applause. It's a popular song, and it's sung to the tune of a Royal Navy song called Hearts of Oak, which is a sort of Rule Britannia kind of thing. You'll be glad I'm not going to sing it to you. Anyway, the second verse says, "True glory can ne'er in this quarrel be won. If New England we conquer, old England's undone. On our brethren, then why attempt to fix shame, since the blood of Great Britain flows warm in their veins?" And so as you see, the chorus is, firm as oak are our hearts, where true glory depends. Steady, boys, steady. We'll always be ready to fight all our foes, not to murder our friends. And then near the bottom where you see the parentheses, it's another reference to the Jacobites. Near relations of some who at court now do thrive, the pretender did join in the year 45. In other words, there's people in the royal court, in the government, who are secret Jacobites, who want to bring back authoritarian government. And in favor disguised with high names, while they roar out for George, in their hearts they are for James. So this is a let's not fight the Americans. There are brothers, they're all related, we're all together, and it's nasty old people in the government that are doing the dirty work here. So now we come on to some upper class supporters of the revolutionary cause, of which there were quite a number. And because, of course, we don't know what ordinary people thought for the most part at all, except from ballads like that one that we just heard, where there was clearly a strong pro-American sentiment. But these people, of course, are the elite. They are the ruling aristocracy, and they felt able to speak up against what they saw was wrong British royal policy. So we have William Pitt in the middle top there in his lovely purple velvet suit. He says in Parliament, "If I were an American, as I am an Englishman, while a foreign troop was landed in my country, I never would lay down my arms. Never, never, never." And John Wilkes, the top right there, about which a whole other talk could be made, also said in Parliament, "I call the war with our brethren in America an unjust and felonious war, because the primary cause and confessed origin of it is to attempt to take their money from them without their consent, contrary to the common right of mankind and those great fundamental principles of the English Constitution. I assert that it is a murderous war, because it is an effort to deprive men of their lives for standing up in defense of property." Oops, sorry. Excuse me. "The great fundamental principles of the English Constitution. I call it a murderous war. Such a war, I fear, will draw down the vengeance of heaven on this devoted kingdom." Joseph Priestley, on the bottom left there, was the discoverer of oxygen, and he wrote a book, The Present State of Liberty in Great Britain and the Colonies, in 1769, supporting the rights of the colonists. And in 1794, he actually emigrated to Pennsylvania. Now, this is one of my favorite characters on the pro-American side. Catherine Macaulay. It's a great portrait. You get a good sense of this person. She's a very strong personality. She was a very respected historian, which was remarkable for the time that a woman would be regarded as a historian. Her brother was the Lord Mayor of London. She married a Scots physician at the age of 29, when she was 29, and then he died. And when she was 47, she married William Graham, who was 21. She visited America in 1784 and stayed with Thomas Jefferson and had a really wonderful time by the sound of it. And the first 5 of her 8 volumes, history, spell out the principles that justified the War of Independence. She's reviewing the history of the previous 100 years and very explicitly making a connection between the American position. And this is where she boiled this all down into a pamphlet, an address to the people of England, Ireland, and Scotland on the current affairs of everything, blah, 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 blah. This is my favorite quote from her. She says, I'm tempted to give her a sort of rather upper-class British accent. If a civil war commences between Great Britain and her colonies, either the mother country, by one great exertion, may ruin both itself and America, or the Americans, by a lingering contest, will gain the independency. And while a new, flourishing, and extensive empire of freemen is established on the other side of the Atlantic, you, that is the people of Great Britain, will be left to the bare possession of your foggy islands under the sway of a domestic despot, suggesting that the crown is going to become more and more powerful, or you will become the provinces of some powerful European state. So there. Here's another important person who you probably never heard of. I never heard of him until I started looking into this matter. William Hartley, an MP, I think he was from Bristol, west of England. He was a member of Parliament from 1774 to 1780. He made 36 speeches in Parliament about America and introduced several bills designed to create a workable relationship between Britain and the colonies. There are these numerous bills that he put forward which never got anywhere. He was envisaging a sort of relationship between Britain and its colonies, possessions, whatever you want to call them, such as later developed in the 19th century with Australia, Canada, and New Zealand and South Africa. He was envisaging almost exactly that kind of arrangement, but his words fell on deaf ears. The problem was that Parliament, I'm not supposed to walk away from the podium, I won't. Parliament, which we can think of as the legislative branch, if you're thinking in American terms, was in the pocket of the Crown. The majority of the MPs in Parliament were either intimidated by or in the pocket of the government, the Crown. So they were subservient. They did whatever was asked of them and did not put up much if any, opposition. The opposition that we hear about was the minority, but because it did not have a majority, was not able to effect any effective change in government policy. If that sounds familiar to you, then it certainly should. He says, I shall always think that our American fellow subjects have been driven into resistance in their own defense and in support of those very claims for which we ourselves have taken up arms in former times. So that's an MP, and we've seen the other higher level. Now we're moving a bit down the social scale here to some really rather remarkable people. Here's Thomas Wren, a Presbyterian minister in Portsmouth in southwest of England, and he set up a system for springing American sailors out of jails and smuggling them over to France and safety. The importance of this was that the American sailors caught on the high seas by the Royal Navy could be regarded as pirates. They could be convicted as pirates and therefore hanged. So even if you weren't a pirate at all, you were either in the emerging American Navy or you were on, just doing your own business on your own ship. If you were captured by the Royal Navy, you were in deep trouble. And Wren thought this was unjust and had to be opposed. And it was a daring and illegal act to help them escape. And he received a letter of thanks from Congress. And he wrote back to Elias Boudinot, another Princetonian, on the receipt of this. He says, giving all possible assistance to men suffering so deeply and in such a cause appeared to me to be in the strictest sense my duty. Another individual, William Hodgson, a prosperous London merchant. He just organized aid and, just supplies, money, food, and advice and help to imprisoned American seamen. Again, which was a brave thing to do, and did it without fear. I'm going to swip over this. This is just, these are petitions that were sent to Parliament, some of which got back to Benjamin Franklin, saying, petitions from people saying, we don't think the Americans should be penalized. They have right on their side. Friends of American liberty, the top quote there, friends to American liberty are friends to mankind. So there was a certain sense at some levels that this was an important matter that needed addressing. So what do we have? In 1776, we've already seen this. Here's the hoity-toity British lady on the left here. Her shield here has for obedience underneath it, and a compass, the moral compass heading north, and a British oak on the top. The Indian princess has a liberty cap. This is the red cap of liberty, that which it tend to associate with the French Revolution a few years later, but had a long tradition of being the thing that you wore if you'd been a slave and you were liberated. So this red cap of liberty was very, very important. And a cockerel crowing, the new era is coming in. And I think at the bottom it says liberty. Liberty, yeah, it just says liberty on the bottom. So that was the 1776 cartoon. And then we move on to 1783, where we have the Indian princess and Britannia being reconciled together. And at the top it says, "Dearest Mamma, let us say no more about it." And Britannia is saying, "Be a good girl and give us a kiss, give us a kiss." We're all friends again. Of course, it wasn't quite as amicable as that, but anyway, the situation was resolved. And here's a quote from one of the British officers: "I am of the opinion that it is right to treat our enemies as if they may one day be our friends." Moving forward in time a little bit, this is a book you probably may not be at all familiar with, but it was very popular in Britain for many generations. It's called 1066 and All That, A Memorable History of England, which is a comic history of what you can't really remember about history. And this is what they say about America. They talk about the war. So after this, the Americans made Whittington, I was getting his name wrong, they made Whittington president and gave up speaking English and became the USA and Columbia and 100%, etc. This was a good thing in the end, as it was the cause of the British Empire, but it prevented America from having any more history. I just wanted to go back, if I can, very quickly to the beginning. What was it like to be in Britain and North America in, say, around 1770? Consider this. The executive branch of government is regularly abusing the authority given it to it by law and by custom. It uses dubious methods to arrest and attempt to silence advocates of free speech. Oh, come on. It uses dubious methods to arrest and attempt to silence advocates of free speech. It uses deadly force against protesters. In the late 1760s, there were riots in London particularly, and the British Army fired on the protesters, killing several of them. Imagine the legislative branch, the majority of whose members are subservient to the executive, either out of fear or out of self-interest or both. Imagine a judicial branch more concerned with securing rights of property and privilege than supporting constitutional norms. Imagine a vocal opposition unable to make change because it lacks effective power. Yes, that's Great Britain in the years leading up to 1776. Thank you. Obviously, happy to have questions or comments or anything. Are we getting any comments on Zoom? Yes.
Do you know anything about the British Quaker community's relationship with the revolution?
Oh, that's a very good question. I haven't studied that in detail, but I imagine that they were pretty firmly on the American side. But of course, they were pacifists, so they would not engage in anything. Although in America, there were the fighting Quakers who decided that the cause was so significant that they have to even abandon that principle. But that's a great question. I should look into that. But I imagine that the Quakers were very much in support of the American cause. Yeah. Yep.
How big a deal was the American Revolution to the typical British or
it's very hard to say. It was obviously something that people did know about. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of publication and talk going on. For the mass of people, either in the industrial cities or in the countryside, it probably wasn't a very pressing matter to them. Why it became, I think, impossible for the British government was that it cost too much in the end. It was just a ridiculous money pit with no apparent solution in sight. And the defeat at Yorktown was something of a relief, I think, to Lord North, particularly, who was the Prime Minister at the time. He said, "Oh, thank God, it's all over." But as far as how people thought about it, it's remarkably difficult to know, other than the sort of things that I've pointed out here. But I would guess that a lot of people would feel that Americans are cousins and they seem to be being treated badly. But of course, when you get into a war situation, it's more difficult. People start to take sides more firmly. Anyway, that's about all I can say about that. I think the point in Seller and Yeatman, by the way, that it was the cause of the British Empire, the British history takes consolation in the defeat of the American Revolution by saying, well, because that enabled us to consolidate the rest of the empire and have a really very good empire for another 100 years afterwards. And it's unfortunate they decided to leave, but we still had a jolly good empire after that anyway. Yeah.
This material in my written form where we could look at it or read it, or you can refer to some book or whatever, and I'd like to explore more of this.
Well, I should think we could
Repeat the question.
Yeah, sorry. The question was, is there anywhere we can see this in a sort of written down form? Well, the easiest way I could do that, I think, would be to for us to find a way of posting this presentation with my notes, either on the Hopewell, one of the Historical Society library, whatever, maybe the Hopewell Valley Heritage website, so that you could then access it and not just see the images, but also read the notes. I don't have detailed references and things in the presentation, but it's based on this. So I can provide references and publications and so on if people are interested. Sure. Yeah.
Of course, evidence that the monarchy during the revolution was concerned about the possibility that success of this rebellion would inflame and stimulate resistance or rebelliousness within the UK.
I think that's a very good point. Yes, I think there was. Sorry, the question was there evidence that the monarchy thought that if the American rebellion was allowed to succeed, there'd be other rebellions maybe in Britain or other parts of the empire? And I think the answer is yes. The first place of anxiety would always be Ireland. Always expect rebellions in Ireland. And of course, it was clear to many people that what the crown was trying to do in North America, in the North American colonies, was to establish a stream of revenue that would go straight to the crown from the colonies. In other words, there would be no parliamentary oversight. There would be no legislative branch oversight over this money coming in to the royal coffers. And this would have the effect, of course, of greatly increasing royal power and independence. And there was quite a lot of concern about this at the time, that this was what was going on. There was a project 1775 going on, which was designed to increase royal power. And the also the social repression that was going on, which I haven't had time to talk about, but the attempts to silence the press, which were very unsuccessful, but a general tendency to sort of try to expand the power of the executive was very much noticed. And I think to turn it on its head, like you do, and say, yeah, from the monarchy's point of view, if these guys succeed, it'll be the end of everything. It'll be the end of us. So yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, Sean.
Was there any real debate or discussion about in British, either in Parliament or in society writ large, about why not let the Americans join the Parliament here? Let's give them the representation they want. We have it. Let's give it to them.
Yes, I mean that was suggested, but sorry again. What was there discussion in Parliament or in society generally about, well, why not give the American colonies what they want, particularly maybe representation in Parliament, so that you would then have taxation with representation, and that was discussed. But it's interesting that when Benjamin Franklin was sent over to England on behalf of, I think, Pennsylvania and a couple of other colonies, they said to him, don't fall for that. Because if the American colonies are given representation in the British Parliament, they'll be outnumbered, they'll be outvoted, and they're 3 months away. So it's not going to be feasible. But you remember the politician, the MP I mentioned, who was introducing these bills. He was saying, look, there'll be a general assembly of the American colonies, and that will that will be able to levy revenue and taxes and so on, and that will be how it will work. Still be under the crown, but independent in almost every other respect, except that we have the very strong trade and cultural and economic links that are so important. There were serious attempts to try and resolve this, but it really often came down to, and it's a sort of cliche to say this these days, but it came down to the intransigence of George III. He did not want, and I think you're going back to your point, he did not want to concede this because of the precedent that it would set. But of course, as you move into the 19th century, the British government realizes, I think this is probably what we should do. Hello, Canada. Why don't you become a little more self-governing? Australia, become a little more self-governing. It's cheaper that way anyway. So it's ironic, really, that this. Well, I don't think it's ironic. I think the American Revolution, in terms of British history, was a catalyst. It made everybody rethink what the empire was supposed to be about and how you were going to rule it. So, as Seller and Wheatman said, it was a good thing. They always put it capital good thing. Yes.
So, in what way, if at all, did British feelings about French play into this? French had a substantial role.
Yeah, well, it was rather convenient it was a disaster, but it was convenient as well for the British when the French came in, because you could blame it on them. Well, we'd have won if it wasn't for the French. You may recall that I think it's at Yorktown, General Cornwallis tries to surrender to the French. So, oh, you've defeated us again. It's another of these little European wars. But the French won't let him. He said, no. You got to give it to the Americans. I think when the French came in, it was sort of, oh, well, they would, wouldn't they? You know. But of course, from a French point of view, it bankrupted. It bankrupted the French state and led directly to the French Revolution, which was a much less pleasant affair than the one that we had here. Yeah.
Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and it had a huge and immediate impact. And he had the revolution in America in mind. So was there any kind of economic argument that began to weigh in on whether this war should be funded?
Yes, thanks for raising that. The question was, Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. And of course, it's a powerful advocate for free trade, not the sort of protectionist policies that the British and all other empires tended to have. And he said, you know, you're going to make, everything's going to be much better if we don't have these sort of protectionist colonial dependent relationships. And if everybody can just trade freely, we'll all be much better off. And yes, that did start to affect people's thinking quite quickly. And in fact, I think within 10 years of the end of the revolution, British-American trade was vastly greater than it had been during the colonial period. So Smith's, from an economic point of view, Smith was absolutely right, and people saw it. So that was another, I think, effect of the revolution, sort of, and how Britain then began to think about how it should administer the remaining bits of its empire. Yeah. Yeah.
What was the aftermath of the war? And I wonder, was there a reconciliation? Or I mean, within 30 years, they're back at each other's throat.
Yeah. I mean, it was yeah, the question was, you know, what really happened after the revolution, both as far as Britain and British-American relations. Well, of course, there was a lot of bitterness about it. I mean, again, George III was never really reconciled to the fact that this had happened. But as soon as people realized there was money to be made again, that started to ease off. And of course, we have in 1787, I think it's the Jay Treaty, which is the first sort of formal treaty between the independent United States and Britain. And among the things that does is start to ease up trade relationships and things like that. Yeah.
Giving a pause to see if there are any virtual questions. Any questions from the line?
No. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, and of course there's a lot of the Anglo-American relationship is an interesting one because there's a lot of admiration and mutuality and all that. And there's also friction too. It goes on all the time. Kathy, my wife, and I were just listening to a book today which mentioned the tension in the Civil War, in that the British government was inclined to support the Confederacy because of the cotton. But the mass of the people in England didn't want to do that at all, and eventually that side prevailed, and the support was more given to the North. And of course, the War of 1812, which was a lot of irritation, is a sort of irritated war. Actually, if you want to read a real swashbuckling story, the British raid on Washington in 1814 is, whatever you might think of it, as an act of war, was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliantly done. It was a small force, a small professional force. They didn't even have any guns with them, any big guns. And it was a quick in and out. They weren't attempting to reconquer America. They were intending to burn down the public buildings of Washington, D.C., and they did. Anyway, it's a great story. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming on this cold evening. Thank you so much.